The worst day of your life can become the beginning of the truth you were never supposed to find. Olivia Bennet never imagined those words would describe her own life. The lunch rush at Harbor Grill had been relentless from the moment the doors opened. Customers filled nearly every table, servers rushed between the kitchen and dining room, and managers moved through the restaurant trying to keep everything under control. Olivia had worked there for nearly 8 years. She knew the menu by heart, remembered the names of regular customers, and rarely made mistakes. At 47 years old, she took pride in doing her job well. That was why the accusation hurt so much. It happened shortly after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. A customer complained that an expensive order had been entered incorrectly. Before Olivia could explain what had actually happened, the restaurant manager blamed her in front of staff and guests. Olivia tried to remain calm. She explained that the order had been changed after it was entered into the system. Several co-workers knew she was telling the truth. Unfortunately, nobody spoke up. The manager had already made his decision. The dining room grew quiet as the argument continued. Olivia felt dozens of eyes watching her. Embarrassment spread across her face. She had always worked hard. She had always been dependable. Yet none of that seemed to matter. The manager finally pointed toward the exit. "Turn in your apron and leave." Olivia stared at him in disbelief. "You are firing me?" "Effective immediately." The words landed like a heavy weight. For a moment she simply stood there. 8 years of dedication had disappeared in less than 60 seconds. Slowly, she untied her apron and placed it on the counter. No dramatic speech. No argument. No scene. She simply nodded and walked away. Outside, dark clouds covered the afternoon sky. A cold rain had started falling. Olivia stepped onto the sidewalk carrying a small bag containing her personal belongings. She felt lost. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Her savings account was already thin. Finding another job would not be easy. She lowered her head and began walking toward the bus stop. What she did not realize was that someone had been watching the entire incident from a private dining area near the front window. Charles Whitmore, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the state, had been meeting with several executives during lunch. He rarely paid attention to restaurant drama. Yet something about Olivia's quiet dignity had caught his attention. Most people would have shouted or demanded justice. Instead, she accepted the humiliation with remarkable composure. As Charles prepared to leave, he glanced through the window and saw Olivia standing alone in the rain. At that exact moment, a gust of wind shifted the collar of her coat. A silver pendant slipped into view. Charles froze. His hands stopped moving. The world around him seemed to disappear. He stared through the glass, unable to look away. The pendant hanging from Olivia's neck was unlike anything most people would notice. But Charles noticed every detail instantly. The shape. The engraving. The tiny symbol carved into the center. His heart began pounding. It could not be possible. He had not seen that design in more than 30 years. Memories he had spent decades trying to understand came rushing back without warning. Across the street, Olivia continued walking, unaware of the shock she had just caused. Charles stepped away from the table so suddenly that his business associates looked confused. He ignored their questions. His eyes remained fixed on the woman disappearing into the rain. For the first time in decades, he felt as though a door from the past had unexpectedly opened. And if what he thought he had seen was real, then Olivia Bennet might be carrying a secret far greater than either of them could possibly imagine. Olivia Bennet had almost reached the bus stop when she heard someone calling from behind. At first she ignored it. The rain continued falling and the city noise drowned out most sounds around her. Then she heard the voice again. "Excuse me. Mississippi." She turned slowly. A tall man in a dark overcoat was approaching through the rain. It took her a moment to recognize him. He had been sitting inside the restaurant earlier. She remembered seeing him at one of the private tables. What she did not know was that nearly everyone in Chicago would have recognized him instantly. Charles Whitmore rarely appeared in public without attracting attention. Olivia looked confused as he stopped a few feet away. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. Charles glanced briefly at the silver pendant around her neck before meeting her eyes again. "I apologize for stopping you like this." Olivia nodded cautiously. "That is all right." Charles seemed unusually uncomfortable. He was a man accustomed to negotiating billion-dollar agreements without hesitation. Yet now he struggled to find the right words. "That necklace," he finally said. Olivia instinctively touched the pendant resting against her coat. "What about it?" Charles stared at it again. The symbol engraved into the silver surface was exactly as he remembered. The same delicate design. The same unique craftsmanship. The same detail he had not seen since he was a young man. "Where did you get it?" he asked. Olivia frowned slightly. The question felt strangely personal. "It belonged to my mother." Charles felt his heartbeat accelerate. "Did she tell you where it came from?" Olivia shook her head. "Not really. She always wore it. Before she passed away she gave it to me." For several seconds neither spoke. Rain tapped softly against the sidewalk around them. Charles looked away momentarily as old memories resurfaced. More than 30 years earlier, his younger sister had owned an identical pendant. It had vanished along with several unanswered questions that haunted his family to this day. Olivia studied his expression carefully. "Why are you asking?" Charles considered how much to reveal. "Because I have seen one exactly like it before." Olivia's eyes widened slightly. "You have?" Charles nodded. "Many years ago." The answer only created more questions. Olivia had worn the pendant for most of her adult life. Nobody had ever reacted to it before. Nobody had ever claimed to recognize it. "That seems impossible," she said quietly. "Maybe." Charles looked directly at her. "Or maybe it is not." The conversation felt increasingly strange. Olivia was tired, unemployed, soaked from the rain, and emotionally exhausted. From losing her job. The last thing she expected was a mysterious conversation about an old necklace. "Look," she said gently, "I appreciate your concern, but I really need to get home." Charles immediately understood. He reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. Olivia glanced at it and froze. Charles Whitmore. The name was impossible to miss. She looked back up at him in surprise. "You are Charles Whitmore?" He offered a small nod. "If you are willing, I would like to speak with you again." Olivia stared at the card. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone did. "About a necklace?" she asked. "About your family," Charles replied. The word struck her unexpectedly. Olivia had very little family left. Her mother had passed away years earlier. Her father had never been part of her life. Most questions about her past had remained unanswered. Charles noticed the uncertainty in her eyes. "I am not asking for anything today," he said. "I only believe there may be information you deserve to know." Olivia slipped the card into her coat pocket. Before she could ask another question, Charles looked once more at the pendant. The expression on his face changed. It was no longer simple curiosity. It was recognition. And perhaps even fear. As Olivia boarded the arriving bus a few minutes later, she looked back through the rain-covered window. Charles remained standing on the sidewalk watching her leave. Neither of them realized that a forgotten secret buried for more than 3 decades had just begun to surface. And somewhere inside Charles Whitmore's mansion, an old photograph hidden in storage was waiting to prove that this meeting had never been a coincidence at all. That night Olivia Bennet could not stop thinking about the conversation at the bus stop. Long after she arrived home, Charles Whitmore's words continued echoing in her mind. About your family. The phrase felt strangely personal. Olivia lived alone in a modest apartment on the north side of the city. The space was small but comfortable. Family photographs occupied nearly every shelf. Most featured her mother, Margaret Bennett, smiling beside lakes, parks, and holiday decorations. Olivia stood quietly in front of one photograph for several moments. Her mother had passed away 7 years earlier, taking countless unanswered questions with her. Growing up, Olivia had often asked about her father. The answers were always vague. Sometimes Margaret changed the subject. Other times she simply said that certain parts of the past were better left alone. At the time, Olivia accepted those explanations. Now she was no longer sure she should have. Unable to sleep, she opened a hallway closet and pulled out several storage boxes she had not touched in years. Old photographs, greeting cards, receipts, and family keepsakes filled the containers. For nearly 2 hours she searched through memories. Most items revealed nothing unusual. Then she discovered a small wooden frame tucked beneath a stack of books. Inside was a photograph she had not seen since childhood. The image showed her mother standing beside another woman near a waterfront pier. Both appeared to be in their 20s. Olivia immediately recognized her mother. The second woman, however, was unfamiliar. What caught Olivia's attention was not the woman's face. It was the pendant hanging around her neck. Her hands began trembling. The necklace looked identical to the one she wore every day. Olivia stared at the photograph in disbelief. On the back, written in faded ink, were only 2 names. Margaret and Eleanor. No last names. No date. No explanation. Meanwhile, across the city, Charles Whitmore sat alone inside his private study. He had not slept either. Large storage boxes surrounded his desk. Family records, photographs, and personal documents covered nearly every surface. For hours he searched through material untouched for decades. Finally, shortly after midnight, he found what he was looking for. It was an old family album belonging to his younger sister, Eleanor Whitmore. Charles slowly turned the pages. Birthday parties. School events. Family vacations. Then he stopped. A photograph near the middle of the album immediately captured his attention. Eleanor stood beside a young woman he did not recognize. Around Eleanor's neck hung the same distinctive pendant. Charles looked closer. The second woman wore one too. His pulse quickened. He turned the photograph over. A handwritten note appeared on the back. Summer of 1988. Eleanor and Margaret. Charles leaned back in his chair. Margaret. The same name appeared repeatedly throughout several letters stored nearby. For years he had ignored those references because they seemed insignificant. Now everything felt different. Charles gathered additional documents and continued searching. One letter mentioned that Eleanor trusted Margaret more than anyone else. Another described plans they had made together. Yet none explained why Eleanor eventually disappeared from the family's life. As dawn approached, Charles discovered one final item hidden between the album pages. It was a folded note written in Eleanor's handwriting. Time had faded parts of the message, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. If anything ever happens to me, Margaret knows the truth. Charles stared at the words for a long time. Across the city, Olivia sat holding the photograph she had discovered. Neither knew exactly what the truth was. Yet both now possessed pieces of the same mystery. And for the first time, the possibility that their lives were connected no longer seemed impossible. It seemed inevitable. The next morning Olivia Bennett woke after only a few hours of sleep. The photograph she had discovered remained on the kitchen table exactly where she had left it. Sunlight streamed through the apartment window, illuminating the image of Margaret and the mysterious woman named Eleanor. For years Olivia believed there was nothing left to learn about her mother's past. Now she was no longer certain. The identical pendants. The unfamiliar name. The strange encounter with Charles Whitmore. None of it felt like coincidence anymore. After making coffee, Olivia sat down and examined the photograph again. This time she noticed something she had missed before. In the background stood a building with a distinctive clock tower. The structure seemed familiar. After several minutes she finally remembered why. Her mother had once taken her there as a child. The memory was faint but undeniable. It had been some kind of community center near the waterfront. Olivia suddenly felt a surge of curiosity. If Margaret and Eleanor spent time there together, perhaps someone still remembered them. Meanwhile, Charles Whitmore arrived at his corporate headquarters carrying a folder filled with old family documents. Although important business meetings filled his schedule, he found it impossible to focus. His thoughts remained fixed on Eleanor and Margaret. The note he discovered the previous night haunted him. If anything ever happens to me, Margaret knows the truth. What truth? And why had Eleanor trusted Margaret with something so important? Before noon, Charles instructed a member of his private staff to research every available record connected to the waterfront community center appearing in the old photographs. Within hours several historical documents were located. One detail immediately stood out. During the late 1980s, both Eleanor Whitmore and Margaret Bennett had volunteered there regularly. Charles stared at the report. The connection was now officially documented. Later that afternoon, Olivia made a decision. She would visit the community center herself. The building still existed, although it had been renovated several times over the decades. When she arrived, the familiar clock tower instantly triggered childhood memories she had nearly forgotten. Walking through the entrance felt strangely emotional. The lobby had changed, but parts of the original structure remained. Olivia approached the reception desk and explained that she was researching family history. After listening carefully, an employee suggested she speak with one of the longest-serving volunteers. His name was Walter Hayes. He was 81 years old and had worked with the center for more than 40 years. Olivia found him organizing donated books in a small reading room. At first Walter struggled to remember the names she mentioned. Then she showed him the photograph. His expression changed immediately. "I know those women," he said. Olivia felt her heart skip a beat. Walter adjusted his glasses and studied the image more closely. Margaret and Eleanor. They were here all the time. Olivia sat down across from him. "You remember them?" Walter nodded. "Very well. They were close friends." The answer alone felt significant. Yet what he said next shocked her even more. "There was a little girl with them sometimes." Olivia leaned forward. "A little girl?" Walter nodded again. "Yes. They both cared about her very much." Olivia felt her pulse racing. "Do you remember her name?" Walter looked thoughtful for several moments. Finally he shook his head. "No. But I remember something unusual." Olivia waited. Walter pointed toward the pendant around her neck. "That necklace." Olivia instinctively touched it. Walter smiled softly. "The little girl wore one just like it." Across the city, Charles received a phone call from his research team. Another discovery had been made. Among archived records from the community center was a group photograph taken more than 30 years earlier. Charles requested an immediate copy. When the image arrived, he stared at it in disbelief. Standing side by side were Eleanor Whitmore and Margaret Bennett. Between them stood a small child wearing a silver pendant. And for the first time, Charles realized the child in the photograph looked remarkably like Olivia Bennett. Olivia Bennett left the community center carrying more questions than answers. Walter Hayes had confirmed that Margaret Bennett and Eleanor Whitmore knew each other well. More importantly, he remembered a little girl wearing a pendant identical to the one around Olivia's neck. The discovery should have felt impossible. Yet deep inside, Olivia could not ignore the growing sense that she was somehow connected to a story much larger than herself. That evening, she returned to her apartment and placed every photograph she had collected across her dining table. Images of Margaret. Images of Eleanor. Notes. Letters. Old receipts. Small fragments of a past that suddenly seemed interconnected. As she examined the group photograph from the community center again, one detail caught her attention. Standing behind Margaret and Eleanor was a sign listing sponsors for a charity event. Most names meant nothing to her. One, however, stood out immediately. Whitmore Foundation. Olivia stared at the name. The connection between Eleanor and Charles was no longer just a possibility. It was undeniable. Across the city, Charles Whitmore sat in his study reviewing the same photograph. The resemblance between the little girl and Olivia continued bothering him. The shape of the face. The eyes. Even the way she smiled. It was impossible to dismiss. Yet Charles refused to jump to conclusions. He needed facts. Not assumptions. Determined to learn more, he contacted Olivia the following morning. When his name appeared on her phone, she hesitated before answering. Their previous encounter had been brief and mysterious. Now she was not sure what to expect. "Good morning, Olivia," Charles said. "I believe we need to compare what we have discovered." 2 hours later they met at a quiet coffee shop overlooking Lake Michigan. Olivia brought the photograph from her apartment. Charles brought copies of the records his team had located. Neither wasted time with small talk. The mystery had already become too important. As they spread documents across the table, both quickly realized they had uncovered different pieces of the same puzzle. Olivia showed him the photograph of Margaret and Eleanor together. Charles immediately recognized his younger sister. Then he placed the community center group photograph beside it. Olivia stared at the image in silence. There was no doubt. The little girl looked remarkably familiar. Charles finally spoke. "Do you remember ever meeting Eleanor?" Olivia shook her head. "Not at all." Charles looked disappointed but not surprised. "You would have been very young." Olivia studied the photographs carefully. "Why would my mother never tell me any of this?" Charles had no answer. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. Gradually a strange sense of trust began forming between them. They came from completely different worlds. One had spent years serving customers in restaurants. The other had spent decades building a business empire. Yet both were searching for the same thing. The truth. Before leaving, Charles revealed another discovery. Among Eleanor's personal papers was a reference to a storage box entrusted to Margaret shortly before Eleanor disappeared from public life. Olivia immediately looked up. "A storage box?" Charles nodded. "There is no record of what was inside." Olivia felt a sudden chill. Several years earlier, after her mother's passing, she had moved numerous belongings into a rented storage facility. Most had never been opened. The possibility struck her instantly. "I might still have it." Charles leaned forward. "Are you serious?" Olivia nodded slowly. "I remember one locked wooden box I never managed to open." For a moment neither spoke. The possibility felt enormous. If the box truly came from Eleanor, it might contain answers hidden for more than 3 decades. Later that afternoon, Olivia drove directly to the storage facility. Charles followed in his own vehicle. Together they walked through rows of metal doors until Olivia stopped in front of her unit. As she lifted the door, dust filled the air. Old furniture, boxes, and family belongings sat untouched. Then, near the back wall beneath a blanket-covered chair, Olivia spotted something that made her heart race. A small wooden box with a tarnished brass lock. And carved into the top was the exact same symbol engraved on her pendant. For several seconds neither Olivia Bennet nor Charles Whitmore moved. They simply stared at the small wooden box resting near the back of the storage unit. Dust covered its surface, evidence that nobody had touched it in many years. Yet the symbol carved into the brass lid was unmistakable. It matched the engraving on Olivia's pendant perfectly. The sight sent a chill through both of them. Charles slowly stepped closer. "That is the same mark," he said quietly. Olivia nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. Every clue they had uncovered over the past few days seemed to be leading toward this moment. The mysterious pendant. The photographs. Margaret Bennet. Eleanor Whitmore. Now a locked box hidden away for decades. Carefully, Olivia lifted it from the shelf. The box was heavier than she expected. Whatever was inside had remained protected for a very long time. They carried it out of the storage unit and placed it inside Charles's vehicle. Neither wanted to risk damaging it. An hour later they sat together in Charles's private study. The box rested on a large wooden desk beneath soft lighting. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the city skyline. Inside, anticipation filled the room. The lock had no visible key. Olivia searched through the items she had brought from storage but found nothing useful. Charles eventually contacted a professional locksmith. 30 minutes later an elderly locksmith arrived and examined the box carefully. "Very old craftsmanship," he said. "Not easy to open without the key." Olivia exchanged a nervous glance with Charles. Finally, after several minutes of careful work, a quiet click echoed through the room. The lock released. The locksmith stepped back. "There you go." After he left, silence returned. Olivia slowly lifted the lid. Inside were several neatly organized items wrapped in protective cloth. The first bundle contained photographs. Some showed Eleanor Whitmore and Margaret Bennet together at different locations. Others included a little girl. As Olivia examined them more closely, her heart began racing. The child appeared repeatedly throughout the collection. In some pictures Eleanor held her hand. In others Margaret stood beside her. And around the child's neck hung the same silver pendant. Charles studied the images in disbelief. "It is the same girl from the community center photograph," he said. Olivia nodded. Deep down she already knew. The little girl looked exactly like her younger self. Beneath the photographs rested a collection of letters. Most were written by Eleanor. Several were addressed to Margaret. Olivia carefully unfolded one of them. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. The letter spoke of friendship, trust, and responsibility. Eleanor thanked Margaret for helping protect something precious. Yet frustratingly, she never explained exactly what that something was. Another letter contained similar language. The same references. The same secrecy. The same unanswered questions. Then Charles discovered a sealed envelope at the bottom of the box. Unlike the other documents, this one appeared untouched. Across the front were handwritten words that immediately captured their attention. To be opened only when the time is right. Beneath the message was Eleanor's signature. Olivia felt her pulse pounding. Charles looked equally stunned. Slowly she broke the seal and removed the contents. Inside was a single folded letter and a photograph. Before reading the letter, Olivia examined the image. The moment she did, her breath caught. The photograph showed Eleanor, Margaret, and the same little girl standing together in front of a hospital. On the back was a date. The date corresponded exactly with the month and year listed on Olivia's birth certificate. Charles looked at her in silence. Neither needed to say what they were thinking. The possibility had become impossible to ignore. With trembling hands, Olivia unfolded Eleanor's letter. The first few sentences discussed family, promises, and difficult decisions. Then she reached a line that instantly changed everything. Eleanor wrote that if anyone was reading the letter decades later, it meant the truth could finally be revealed. Olivia continued reading. But before she reached the next paragraph, a small folded document slipped from between the pages and landed on the desk. Both stared at it. Printed across the top were words neither expected to see. Certificate of birth. For a long moment neither Olivia Bennet nor Charles Whitmore touched the document lying on the desk. The word certificate of birth seemed almost unreal beneath the soft light of the study. Everything they had uncovered over the past several days had pointed toward a hidden truth, but now that truth felt dangerously close. Olivia slowly reached for the folded paper. Her hands trembled. Years of unanswered questions pressed heavily on her mind. Questions about her father. Questions about her mother's silence. Questions she had stopped asking long ago because she believed no answers existed. Charles remained silent as she carefully unfolded the certificate. The room seemed to grow smaller with every second. Olivia's eyes moved across the page. Date of birth. Hospital name. Official registration information. Everything appeared legitimate. Then she reached the section identifying family information. Her breathing stopped. Charles watched her expression change instantly. "What is it?" he asked softly. Olivia could not answer right away. She simply handed him the document. Charles studied it carefully. The information explained part of the mystery but not all of it. Margaret Bennet's name appeared exactly where expected. Yet another name listed on the document changed everything. Eleanor Whitmore. Charles lowered the paper slowly. His heart pounded. For decades he had searched for answers regarding his younger sister. Now her name appeared directly on a document connected to Olivia's birth. Neither understood the full explanation yet, but one fact was becoming impossible to ignore. Eleanor's connection to Olivia had been far deeper than anyone realized. Charles immediately returned his attention to the letter Eleanor had left behind. Together they began reading the remaining pages. Eleanor described a period of her life filled with uncertainty and difficult decisions. She repeatedly praised Margaret's loyalty and friendship. Several passages revealed that Margaret had protected a secret for many years. Yet Eleanor still avoided stating the complete truth directly. It was almost as though she feared the information might fall into the wrong hands. Then they reached a section written near the end of the letter. Eleanor explained that circumstances forced her to make choices she never expected. She trusted Margaret more than anyone else and believed one day the truth would eventually reach the person who deserved to know it most. Olivia felt tears gathering in her eyes. Every sentence made her mother's sacrifice more apparent. Margaret had spent decades carrying responsibilities she never discussed. As they continued reading, another item slipped from the envelope. This time it was a small photograph. Olivia picked it up carefully. The image showed Eleanor sitting on a hospital bed holding a newborn infant wrapped in a blanket. Standing beside her was Margaret. Both women appeared emotional. Written on the back were only 4 words. The beginning of everything. Charles stared at the photograph. The infant's face was impossible to identify, but the timing aligned perfectly with the birth certificate. Olivia looked between the photograph and the letter. Questions continued multiplying. If Eleanor was connected to her birth, why had Margaret raised her alone? Why had Eleanor disappeared? Why had nobody ever spoken about any of it? The answers remained frustratingly incomplete. Hours passed as they reviewed every document inside the box. Most reinforced the same themes. Trust. Protection. Family. Secrecy. Yet none provided definitive closure. Eventually Charles leaned back in his chair. There is someone else who might know more. Olivia looked up. Who? Charles thought for a moment before answering. A family attorney who handled several private matters for Eleanor many years ago. Olivia immediately understood the significance. If anyone possessed additional records, it would likely be him. Charles made a phone call that evening. To his surprise, the attorney was still alive and living in a neighboring state. More importantly, he agreed to meet them. Before ending the conversation, the attorney said something neither Charles nor Olivia expected. "If you found Eleanor's box," the elderly man said, "then you are finally close to understanding what really happened." The line went silent. Charles slowly lowered the phone. Olivia stared at him. Neither spoke for several moments. The birth certificate had revealed part of the mystery. The letter had revealed more. Yet the most important answers still waited somewhere ahead. And for the first time, both sensed they were approaching the moment when decades of secrecy would finally come to an end. 2 days later, Olivia Bennet and Charles Whitmore drove across state lines to meet the attorney who had once worked closely with Eleanor Whitmore. The journey felt longer than it actually was. Neither spoke much during the drive. Too many questions remained unanswered. The birth certificate, the photographs, the letters, and the mysterious box had revealed fragments of the truth, but the larger picture still remained hidden. By early afternoon they arrived at a quiet town surrounded by rolling hills and old neighborhoods. The attorney, Richard Hale, lived in a modest brick house that looked nothing like the offices of powerful legal professionals Olivia had imagined. Time had softened everything about the property except the man waiting at the door. Though well into his 80s, Richard's eyes remained sharp. The moment he saw Charles, recognition appeared on his face. Then he looked toward Olivia and became unusually quiet. "You have her eyes," he said softly. Olivia froze. "Whose eyes?" Richard hesitated. "Eleanor's." The statement sent a wave of emotion through both visitors. Richard invited them inside and led them to a study filled with books, legal files, and decades of carefully organized records. After everyone sat down, Charles explained everything they had discovered. The photographs. The letters. The pendant. The birth certificate. Richard listened without interruption. When they finished, he slowly nodded. "Then it is finally time." He stood and walked toward a locked cabinet. From the highest shelf he removed a thick file secured with a faded ribbon. Dust covered its surface. Richard carefully placed it on the desk. "Eleanor asked me to keep this safe until the right people came looking for answers." Olivia felt her heart pounding. Richard opened the file and removed several documents. Some were legal records. Others were personal correspondence. But one document immediately captured their attention. It was a notarized statement written and signed by Eleanor Whitmore. Richard handed it to Olivia first. As she began reading, tears filled her eyes almost immediately. Eleanor explained that many years earlier she had faced circumstances that forced her to make an impossible decision. A newborn child needed stability, protection, and privacy. Margaret Bennet had offered all three. The statement described Margaret not simply as a friend, but as family in every way that truly mattered. Olivia continued reading while Charles watched silently. Then she reached the section that finally revealed the truth. Eleanor wrote that Olivia had been raised by Margaret because Margaret had promised to provide a normal life free from the pressures and complications surrounding the Whitmore family at that time. The arrangement had been made out of love, not abandonment. Every decision had been intended to protect Olivia's future. Charles lowered his head. Decades of misunderstanding suddenly began falling apart. For years he believed Eleanor had simply disappeared from the family. The reality was far more complicated and far more heartbreaking. Richard then revealed one final item. It was a sealed envelope addressed specifically to Olivia. The handwriting matched every other letter Eleanor had written. Olivia carefully opened it. Inside was a personal message. Eleanor described watching Olivia grow from a distance during her early years. She spoke about birthdays she could not attend and milestones she could only hear about through Margaret. Most importantly, she explained that the pendant had always been intended as a symbol connecting them. A reminder that family bonds could survive even through silence. By the time Olivia finished reading, tears were streaming down her face. The answers she had spent her entire life seeking were finally in front of her. Yet Richard was not finished. He leaned forward and looked directly at both of them. "There is one final step," he said. Charles frowned slightly. "What step?" Richard folded his hands. "The record strongly established the truth. But Eleanor left instructions that if any doubt remained, formal confirmation should be obtained." Olivia immediately understood what he meant. Charles did too. The journey that began with a pendant and a chance encounter was approaching its conclusion. Yet one final piece of evidence remained before every question could be fully answered. And for the first time, the truth felt close enough to touch. 3 weeks later, Olivia Bennet and Charles Whitmore sat together inside a private conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. The final confirmation had arrived that morning. Every document, every historical record, and every piece of evidence uncovered during their search had pointed toward the same conclusion. The official verification simply removed the last remaining doubt. Olivia stared quietly at the folder resting on the table. For most of her life she had believed certain questions would never be answered. Now, those answers existed in black and white before her. Yet the strongest emotion she felt was not shock. It was gratitude. Gratitude toward Margaret Bennet, the woman who had raised her with unconditional love. Gratitude toward Eleanor Whitmore, who had spent years trying to protect her future. And gratitude toward the strange chain of events that had begun with a chance encounter on a rainy afternoon. Charles looked out across the water before finally speaking. "My sister would have been relieved to know the truth was finally found." Olivia smiled softly. "I think my mother would have been relieved too." For several moments neither said anything. Words were unnecessary. The journey had never been about money, status, or inheritance. It had always been about understanding where she came from and why so many sacrifices had been made on her behalf. Over the following days, Charles introduced Olivia to members of the extended Whitmore family. Some arrived with curiosity. Others arrived with emotion. A few carried old photographs and stories that had not been shared in decades. As the conversations unfolded, Olivia began learning details about Eleanor's life that had never appeared in any letter or document. She learned about her kindness, her determination, and her deep loyalty toward the people she loved. The more she listened, the more she realized how much of Eleanor lived on through the stories others remembered. One Saturday afternoon, Charles organized a small family gathering at a lakeside property that had belonged to the Whitmore family for generations. It was not a formal event. There were no reporters, no cameras, and no public announcements. Only family members, old friends, and people connected to the story that had finally reached its conclusion. Near sunset, Charles invited everyone to gather near the shoreline. A gentle breeze moved across the water as golden light reflected across the lake. Olivia stood beside him holding the silver pendant that had changed her life. Charles smiled as he looked at it. That little piece of silver carried more history than either of us imagined. Olivia laughed softly. "It certainly did." Then Charles handed her a small wooden frame. Inside was the restored photograph showing Eleanor, Margaret, and the little girl standing together many years earlier. The image had been professionally repaired, allowing every detail to be seen clearly again. Olivia stared at it for a long time. Two women had made difficult choices out of love. One had protected a secret. The other had trusted her completely. Together they had created a future neither could fully predict. Olivia felt tears in her eyes, but this time they were tears of peace rather than uncertainty. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, she placed the pendant around her neck once more. It no longer represented a mystery. It represented family. It represented sacrifice. It represented promises kept across decades. Charles looked toward the water and smiled. "Funny how life works sometimes." Olivia nodded. The worst day of my life led me to the answers I had been searching for my entire life. The two stood quietly together as evening settled over the lake. The questions were gone. The secrets had been revealed. The missing pieces finally fit together. And although the journey had begun with loss, confusion, and uncertainty, it ended with something far more valuable. A family reunited by truth. A legacy preserved through love. And a future built not on hidden secrets, but on understanding, belonging, and hope.